Welcome to the talk exploring mental models of the right to informational self-determination of office workers in Germany. My name is Jan Tolsdorf, and today I present a collaborative work by Florian Dehling, Delphine Reinhardt, Luigi Iacono, and myself. As the title already suggests, the setting of this talk is the employment relationship in Germany. During regular employment, employees usually disclose large amounts of sensitive personal data to their employers. In Germany, this data usually includes the sharing of the social security number, bank account information, religious affiliation, and handicap allowance. The ongoing digitization of work processes also means that the volume of data is increasing and the type of data is becoming more diverse. This situation increases employees' vulnerability to privacy violations and poses a challenge to the preservation and protection of the fundamental right to privacy in employment. In Germany, employees' privacy is protected by the right to informational self-determination. This right warrants each individual transparency and personal control over the collection, use, and disclosure of personal data in all aspects of life. With the advent of the European General Data Protection Regulation in 2018, there are now also legally binding rules for employers to provide tools that empower employees to exercise the right to informational self-determination at work. Legislation tries to balance the difference in power between powerful data controllers such as employers and data subjects such as employees by making both jointly responsible for privacy protection. In particular, the GDPR resulted in new obligations for employers, including but not limited to making transparent which personal data are processed and for what purposes, providing information on risks and rights in a way that is comprehensible to employees, providing intervention options, weighing up their interests against employee privacy and protection needs. For their part, employees are expected to exercise their rights. We argue that this situation poses a dilemma. Privacy controls, which employers have to provide and guarantee for, but which are to be used by employees, can only protect privacy to the extent that employees' perceptions of their rights and obligations are sufficient. From human-computer interaction research, it is well known that people's internal perceptions, also called mental models, of a system, in our case the right to informational self-determination, considerably influence behavior. This poses the threat that if employees had false or significantly limited perceptions of their privacy rights, simply providing privacy controls would reduce the principles of the GDPR to absurdity because employees would simply not exercise their rights. To shed light on this matter, we explored the boundaries of the perceptions of informational self-determination at work by conducting a mental model study with 27 office workers in Germany. We focused on three key research topics. The first topic refers to the perception of categories of data and therewith associated terminology. That is, the right to informational self-determination stipulates different rules for the processing of different categories of data in the employment relationship. We have identified the following 6 terms that are frequently used in practice to describe different types of data. Please note that unlike in English, the literal translation of personal data into German means such data with a strong personal reference and must not be confused with the English legal term personal data. In practice, office workers are frequently confronted with these terms when interacting with data protection guidelines or software. For example, this is a single screenshot of an excerpt of a German privacy statement of a large office suite provider in which 3 different terms are used interchangeably. The second research topic refers to the concept of informational self-determination at work. It is important to note that this right is exercised differently in the employment relationship than, for example, in private online use. This is because the right is not absolute and is limited by the work context. For example, data processing is permitted without formal consent of employees if the processing is either essential or permitted by national law or collective agreements. Employers also typically try to avoid consent, as it can be very difficult to manage consent in practice, especially because it can be revoked at any time. Transparency rights, on the other hand, remain largely unaffected and are quite extensive. At this point, we were interested in finding out to what extent employees were familiar with the concept of informational self-determination and what requirements for transparency and control they derive from it. Last but not least, the third research topic refers to employees' awareness of personal data processing. Past studies already revealed that online users in particular often have a poor understanding of the data flow and the extent of processing activities going on. We therefore investigated office workers' perceptions of data storage and data flow, but also explored their beliefs with respect to which precise safeguards are implemented and which threat models exist. To explore these research topics, we conducted a mental model study based on semi-structured interviews and proceeded as follows. To derive the interview guidelines, we carried out an expert model approach with an iterative design. For this, we first reviewed legal text and related work to extract different themes of informational self-determination and organized them into groups. We then conducted 2 expert group sessions with researchers from law, psychology, ergonomics, IT systems, as well as security and privacy to revise and fine-tune the model. We then derived interview guidelines from the model and revised them with researchers' experience in conducting interviews. We also conducted 3 pilot interviews with office workers to fine-tune the questions and wording. In the interview, we first asked participants to explain the 6 different terms and provide examples with relation to their job. We then discussed all sorts of issues related to transparency and control over personal data in employment, concluding with the question of what informational self-determination means to them. We then asked how certain data were processed by their employer and emphasized on the involved processes, potential threats, and safeguards that participants believed to exist. Finally, respondents filled out a demographic questionnaire at the end of the interview. The interviews lasted between 30 to 90 minutes and were analyzed using an inductive coding approach by 2 coders. In total, we recruited 27 employees from 9 different organizations of different size. We had a balanced sex distribution and participants' age ranged between 24 and 58 years. Typical for office workers, the level of education in our sample was relatively high, since the minimal educational level was secondary school and 17 participants even held an academic degree. For our analysis, we divided our participants into 3 groups of different professional backgrounds and experience with data processing. The first group comprised administration employees who were mainly concerned with the management of financial resources and project controlling. The second group comprised computer scientists and software developers from security engineering, requirements engineering, and B2B software. The third group comprised employees with activities other than the processing of personal data and without a computer science background. 5 participants held a management or leadership position at the time of the interviews. Let us now have a look at our results. With respect to terminology and the perception of categories of data, our results are somewhat ambivalent. On the one hand, the answers we received indicate that the terms evoke adequate associations in a broader sense. In our coding, we identified recurring themes in the participants' explanations. Based on these themes, participants distinguish between 3 broader concepts. The first concept arises from data and information and largely lacks privacy-related attributes. These terms were described relating to data that have no direct personal reference but are very relevant for daily work. The second group arises from PII and IRI and symbolizes data with clear personal references. Participants explained that such data identify them uniquely, either directly or because one could also infer their identity from such data. The third concept is defined by private data and symbolizes data with no business relevance and strong access restrictions. On the other hand, however, we received most contradicting statements about the term personal data. A quarter of participants claimed that it had no reference to a person, whereas another quarter claimed that this data directly concerned a person and their identity. I would like to remind that this does not refer to the English term personal data used by the GDPR, but data emphasizing the personal reference. Moreover, half of participants explicitly asked for clarification or stated that they struggle to identify meaningful differences between these 6 terms. Apart from the legal meaning, though, participants intuitively refer to different privacy boundaries in their explanations of the different terms. Here, the assumed business relevance played a decisive role for whether data belonged to the public or private sphere. This was associated with expectations of control and claims to ownership. However, participants made conflicting assumptions about privacy spheres, ownership and control for the same data concepts. Possible consequences of the identified lack of familiarity with these terms' legal meanings favors unintended privacy turbulences, either because employees access data without authorization or incorrectly assume no access because they do not understand the privacy rules. We therefore conclude that the use of common terms is likely to leave office workers in an uninformed state, since they are unaware of the rights and obligations that actually apply to them. Let us now turn to the second research topic, the concept of the right to informational self-determination at work. We divided the aspects discussed by our participants into 4 thematic categories. Based on these 4 categories, we then conducted a hierarchical clustering analysis to examine correlations among our participants. We identified a meaningful 3-cluster solution. We refer to the first group as privacy doctrinarists. The group comprises 8 participants who demanded the unrestricted validity of the right to informational self-determination at work, requiring full control over the processing of personal data. In addition, they partially recognized the value of ex-post control, and they were also the only group that recognized transparency as an important key aspect of privacy. Emphasis was put on information about which personal data are stored and who has access to data. The control-seeking pragmatists formed the second group, comprising 10 participants. For them, informational self-determination was tantamount to control over the disclosure of personal data. Mental models were characterized by the primary goal of limiting disclosure to absolutely necessary data. They defined self-determination as the key element of privacy and required employers to respect decisions to withhold data, though they tended to accept limitations to privacy due to employment. The third group comprises 9 participants and is referred to as data flow concern protectionists. They had a strong desire to protect their privacy outside the organization. We found strong claims towards an ability to gain control over the forwarding of data by employers and the audience to whom personal data were disclosed. They demanded to be asked for explicit consent and expected full control over the processing of data. Nevertheless, some mental models also show traits of accepting restrictions. Furthermore, participants discussed issues of mental load. They noticed the high cognitive demand that was necessary to truly capture the complexity of self-determined privacy decisions and pointed out the associated high time costs managing privacy. They also pointed out the limitations of current privacy controls in many situations. For example, they felt powerless either because there was no way of saying no to data processing or because they were unsatisfied with the controls they have. In particular, they complained about the insufficiency of privacy settings. To conclude our findings, our investigation reveals that informational self-determination at work is associated with different meanings, objectives, and problems. While our findings are consistent with previous work highlighting the importance of control over the gathering and handling of personal data, our results also indicate that transparency can be another important dimension. However, despite discussing aspects of transparency with all participants, our analysis does not provide an answer as to why 2 clusters ignore transparency as a key element of privacy. Nevertheless, their strong claims for ex-ante control might actually reflect a lack of transparency in the work context, which is compensated for by considering the moment of disclosure as the most important control point for privacy protection. Since the work context severely restricts employees' rights towards ex-ante control, it is probably fair to assume that office workers also perceive their right to informational self-determination as severely restricted in practice if their mental models are focused exclusively on self-determination. Let us now have a look at the last research topic. Participants generally believe that the master data they disclose to their employers, such as bank details and private address, were stored in digital and analog paper format. For digital copies, they pointed out that such data resided on an unmanageable amount of databases and end-user devices inside and outside the organization. Also, because such data are often available in transmission media such as emails. For metadata, such as phone records, almost all respondents were uncertain as to whether, and if so, where this data would be stored. For example, non-IT staff speculated that phone records were stored directly in the phone itself. They also reacted with surprise at their own ignorance, and most respondents, including managers, had no ideas about who could actually access these records within the organization and which details were stored. Concerning the processing of data in the course of payroll preparation, respondents had difficulties in clearly identifying the recipients of their data and were unsure which data were actually made available to whom. Let us now turn to the safeguards and threat models that our participants believe to exist. 9 participants explicitly stated that they were completely unaware of the extent to which safeguards existed for personal data and also expressed displeasure in realizing their knowledge gaps. Yet, the vast majority identified a functioning authorization concept in the form of role-based access control within the organization as the most important safeguard. Technical laymen in particular associated strong security convictions with the safeguard as the ultimate gatekeeper. Administrative and IT staff also stressed the importance of appropriate procedural measures to clearly assign rights and responsibilities. It was followed by beliefs in the solid authentication system
and the protection of data in transit and at rest through encryption and locked bins.
For threat models, the interception of paper communication was considered the easiest and most likely attack vector to obtain unauthorized access to data, especially in the payroll process. We found that our participants identified hackers and their colleagues as the most likely adversaries with similar high mentions. They claimed that colleagues posed a great threat to privacy since they were considered either vulnerable to socializing attacks, or inattentive and careless, or evil super administrators who could easily circumvent technical safeguards and access all data.
To conclude, our participants put a lot of trust in digital data processing and in the infrastructure of their employers. They were also generally aware of the processing of data in various processes. However, they were unsure of the exact personal data being processed and the entities involved in the processing. Also, next to hackers, colleagues are perceived as a threat to privacy.
We now come to the conclusion of our study. Our examination reveals a variety of issues of the perceptions, concepts, and awareness of the right to informational self-determination at work that could hinder employees from exercising it in practice. The most obvious boundaries are the one-dimensional views of this right as mere ex-ante control and the lack of awareness of personal data processing. To help employees identify the presence of personal data and the rules for processing that apply to specific data, we advocate using explicit descriptions rather than terminology that evokes inconsistent and contradictory associations. For this, employers may refer to the themes we identified. Concerning risk awareness, our investigation suggests that employees trust their employers with their data. While this is good news for employers, this trust relationships runs the risk of being severely disrupted in the event of a data protection incident. To prevent disillusionment and counteract uncertainty, it should be in employers' best interest to enhance the mental models of employees and further strengthen the trust culture by making personal data processing more transparent and provide details on the involved entities and the scope of safeguards. For control, there appears to be a disparity between the high demands for ex-ante control that we found and the degree of control that the legal framework and the work context allow. We hypothesize that this bias results from the privacy controls available in practice, which appear to be characterized by ex-ante control outside the work context. Yet it is questionable whether the provision of ex-ante control would be helpful, because controls to which people are accustomed do not seem to meet their expectations. This suggests that employees' privacy actually benefits from current practice of dispensing with consent in the work context because free consent is too burdensome. Also, despite scientific and legal efforts to provide transparency-enhancing tools, their value to the right to privacy and their potential to reduce the burden of privacy management must also be promoted in the future. For future research on privacy at work, we recommend to take into consideration trust in affiliated parties such as customers or external processors, trust in colleagues and IT staff, as well as employees' assumptions on implemented safeguards. Quantitative research in particular could include them as control variables or antecedents to explore their impact on employees' privacy perceptions. Thank you for your attention.